Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for having us here today. I'm Katie Cann. I'm a researcher at Rutgers University, and my colleague here, Leichenko, and I are working on this project together with two great community partners in Groundwork Elizabeth, New Jersey, and Groundwork Hudson Valley, based up in Yonkers, New York. And this project that we've been working on for a couple years now is focused on the idea of local leadership of adaptation a bit broadly. So we want to explore specifically how we can kind of build capacity for local leaders working on adaptation to climate risks in the Hudson River watershed, and then work with them on addressing specific climate risks, which we'll get into. So some background for the project. These are two areas that are, of course, in the New York metropolitan area, but distinctly outside of the city. So we're working with these fairly industrialized spaces that often have a little bit lower investment and capacity within climate adaptation spaces. And Groundwork Elizabeth and Groundwork Hudson Valley, our partners, have kind of filled a gap in terms of governance of some of these adaptation projects. And in particular, they're working on addressing a whole host of issues from extreme heat and air quality. But we're in this project really interested in working with them on addressing extreme rainfall events and associated flooding concerns. So the project aims of this work are multiple. We are kind of envisioning this critical gap of trying to understand how these community-based organizations, which are often a little bit lower resource than other groups working in these spaces, can kind of build capacity to do the types of work, the type of work and the types of projects that they want to do. How can we kind of understand the capacity that they already have? And then how can we form relationships with these organizations to increase that capacity? So this project aims to specifically identify the strategies and capacity barriers facing that these organizations use and face for effective and equitable, really importantly, governance of these adaptation spaces. And when we're talking about equity, we've talked a lot about what that means with our partners, and we can get into that, but their focus is really on community engagement, kind of broadening the spaces for community voices to guide their own policy and their own project planning, but also kind of setting the priorities for a climate safe future in these spaces. And then we're going to kind of also work with these groups to build their capacity through this project to proactively respond to these climate risks, in particular extreme rainfall. So we've outlined three kind of buckets of project goals that we'll get into, specifically thinking about impact, the focus of our workshop today. But again, that first goal is about building capacity, and we envision doing this by developing a governance framework that kind of helps us understand and parse through some of the factors that these groups use to respond to these risks. And also to collect data, kind of collect evidence, similar to what Elizabeth was talking about, to help these groups kind of plan for future interventions, specifically green infrastructure, urban agriculture, urban forestry projects that they use to respond to flooding in their neighborhoods. This project also kind of taking a little bit of a more meta approach to it and thinking about co-production of knowledge and engaged research and collaboration aims to develop and strengthen inter-organizational and cross-sector relationships and build these coalitions. So our two partners are part of the same national network of nonprofits, but they don't actually have a lot of opportunity to overlap with each other. And so they were both excited about the chance to kind of, through this funded effort, share knowledge across their domains, share information about how these adaptation projects are happening in their city, and kind of learn from other groups that are in a very, very similar governance context. We're also interested in fostering these relationships between academic researchers and the practitioners on the ground to share kind of the resources that vary based on the institutional positions that we're all within. And then finally, the last bucket is really our impact area. We are hoping to kind of share the learnings of this project with funders and other supporters from well-resourced institutions to inform future projects that are very similar to this. And I'll share a little bit more about that now. Our intended audience for some of the findings of these projects are funders, which we have been ourselves from the university perspective, also working with the Hudson River Foundation on some of these issues, and kind of building on a lot of the learnings that we've encountered by participating in this project and also kind of developing funding projects of our own. So we hope the findings will kind of guide some institutional design and implementation that can better support these local leaders who are practicing adaptation on the ground. We also hope some of our methodological findings from this project and learnings that we take into the future can help engaged researchers design similar projects and kind of improve upon existing efforts into the future. And then finally, for practitioners, we're hoping to support their decision-making processes and enable improved community engagement, public engagement in these spaces to kind of better prepare these communities to meet emerging climate risks. So I do want to talk a little bit about our partners and kind of how the process of partnering with them has gone through this project. We at Rutgers have been working with these two groups since about 2022. And as I mentioned, we were in a position of kind of funding these groups at first. That's how we actually got established our initial relationship. Through our participation in the Consortium for Climate Risk in the Urban Northeast, which is a NOAA RISA team that's based across several universities, stretching from Philadelphia up to Boston was our previous kind of geographic scope. We hosted a small grant program called the Community Climate Resilience Program. And this was an opportunity to fund these community-based organizations who were designing adaptation interventions in the region. And not only fund those projects, but also form these relationships with local researchers to kind of help them develop their work, share in-kind research help when needed, and also kind of go on the ground and kind of work with these groups and establish these relationships so that these institutional spaces of resources were more firmly connected to practitioners on the ground. So the CCR grant kind of wrapped in around 2024, and we did a big evaluation of the project, and we kind of had some questions that emerged from these evaluations. The project was really focused on delivering resources to groups working in frontline communities and responding specifically to environmental justice concerns. And we had outlined a framework within our RFP to kind of guide how our grantees were thinking about equity, talking about it. And when we were evaluating the program, we were really curious to see if our definition and framework kind of resonated with them, or if they needed to maybe mediate some of our expectations with the priorities that were emerging from the community. So we wanted to kind of reflect on that a little bit more deeply and think about what we meant when we were talking about equitable adaptation. So we asked Groundwork Elizabeth and Groundwork Hudson Valley if they were interested in exploring the idea of what equity means in locally led adaptation a little bit more closely. And they were really eager to kind of dig into this, to think about how they defined it within their own organizations, and also partnering to understand or digging a little bit deeper with the community members who are engaged in their work to understand those priorities and how they emerge. So we undertook this project together to kind of really explore what that meant. These groups were also really interested in highlighting some of the governance challenges that they faced, turning those community priorities into projects on the ground. And we're interested in kind of this idea that we were undertaking to do this meta-style research on capacity, kind of highlight some of those barriers, share them out with populations like funders and other institutional supporters who could maybe make some changes to kind of help address some of these challenges. And they were also really eager to continue to strengthen and build some of these cross-sector relationships and those inter-organization relationships that I mentioned. So I'll just share a little bit of background about both of our partners. Groundwork Elizabeth has been based in Elizabeth, New Jersey, which, if you're not familiar, is just south of Newark Airport since about 2023. They have a lot of pollution there from the airport. They're also home to the port facility of Newark and Elizabeth Marine Terminal. And Groundwork Elizabeth has been working in their community on several focus areas, including climate resilience, which is where we partner with them most closely. But they're also working on public health, urban agriculture, urban forestry, trails and restoration along trailways, and really importantly, youth development. They offer some huge youth programs in the summer where they employ youth from across the city who come in and kind of participate in some of their restoration work, get training for urban forestry careers and other efforts like that. Our other partner up in Yonkers, Groundwork Hudson Valley, has been there since 2001. And their mission is to transform urban neighborhoods through partnerships, inspire young leaders, and support local economic development. Really similar kind of drive within their community. They focus on sustainability education. They have an amazing science barge that's parked along the Hudson River. If folks ever get up to Yonkers, I really encourage you to take a look. It's incredible. They also focus on youth leadership again in the summer, offering jobs to people throughout Yonkers to come participate and get job training, and then climate adaptation, space where we work with them most closely. I also want to highlight the other partners that have been super key to this research effort. Rutgers University, of course, the Hudson River Foundation, and CCRN, which I mentioned, which is the NOAA-funded RESA project. These institutions, I think, are not common in the way that they support these stakeholder-driven, community-based, really high-impact research. I think you hear a lot about how researchers are kind of stuck in these institutions where they find it really difficult to fund this type of work and kind of pursue this type of work based on normal academic timelines, which Elizabeth spoke to a little bit, but kind of a focus maybe that doesn't always match some of what the community needs and kind of that applied research focus. And I think we've been really lucky to be based with and affiliated with these institutions that really support these efforts. Okay, so I want to transition a little bit to some of the approaches that have kind of structured the way we develop this project. So the first is thinking about co-production knowledge. How can we work with our partners to kind of collaboratively develop the findings that are guiding and driving this project? And so we've done a lot of time thinking about what engaged research really looks like and kind of best practices, if you will, of what engaged research can be when we really focus on addressing some of the tensions that are always inherent to this work. So we've done a lot of kind of reviewing existing projects, like academic literature, to think through some of these issues and acknowledge that when we're kind of addressing some of the inherent power imbalances, concerns over equity related within the research project and research project governance, we can improve the outcomes and also the process of these engaged research and collaborative research efforts. So we have outlined kind of 3 goals that we have on the left-hand side. The first is to always interrogate our normative aims of the project, meaning when we kind of set out our goals and priorities at the onset, understanding that we always have to iterate on what that actually means and kind of come back with our partners, again, kind of echoing a lot of what Elizabeth was talking about, to make sure that we're still kind of addressing and going towards the goals that we set out on the at the onset. Also acknowledging that the goals that we set forward might actually sometimes be in conflict or can kind of be at odds, I guess I'll say, based on, again, our institutional position, pre-existing biases that you bring into the project, pre-existing knowledge systems that you draw from. So understanding how those aims can kind of also exist and coexist, hopefully, within these spaces is really important. The second bullet that we really want to emphasize is opportunities to enable social learning. Sometimes those are under-celebrated in some of these efforts, but I think some of the biggest outcomes that can come from these engaged and collaborative research spaces are just sharing space and sharing knowledge and letting that kind of go through multiple sources and being kind of transformed as an individual researcher, as an individual practitioner, as someone who's kind of coming to this space for the first time and learning about new things, making sure that we're really making space for those social learning opportunities. And then finally, evaluating outcomes and understanding where we're kind of going from here and how the projects that we're implementing through these collaborative channels are making changes. And then the second, on the right-hand side, we, as I mentioned, did a big evaluation of our small grant program. And we're trying to kind of take our learnings from that evaluation and bring them into this collaborative project and also structure our future efforts. And this really kind of enabled us to spend some time thinking about university community partnerships, which I think have been often antagonistic or sometimes difficult in many senses. And I think that comes from often a power imbalance and inequitable access to resources between kind of the university well-resourced partners and community-based partners or other research partners. And so we came up with kind of some goals that we're really hoping to incorporate here into this effort, which is to streamline access to funding, which Hudson River Foundation has really supported us doing to make sure that our partners are really well funded, not only for covering the folks that participate, that they have to participate in the research, but covering their time as well. Every meeting that we have with them is part of this project, right? And it's, again, something that their time spent that they're not spending on something else. So making sure they're compensated for that engagement. Making sure we're increasing and always sustaining transparency about project goals and where we're headed. Promoting realistic spending options, trying not to overextend within this project has been really key. And then kind of going back to that social learning idea, making sure that we're fostering these communities of practice, maintaining regular communication with these folks, kind of touching base as often as we can, and expanding our network to include other people to join in and to learn from these efforts. We've also done a lot of work that is related that we're trying to pull in from urban climate assessments in New York City. And this is a recent paper that Robin published this year that we're trying to kind of learn from the way that we can continue to link researchers, community members, and then policymakers, returning again to that impact idea and making sure that we're constantly kind of building on those relationships and sustaining them between folks that kind of drive policy and advocacy, the community voices where we hear a lot of the priorities, and the researchers who often have a bit more time to kind of spend dedicated to driving these projects forward. So now I want to dive in a little bit more concretely to our partnership process throughout this project. And I really loved how Elizabeth and Megan had the kind of wheel, because I think that's a little bit better than this linear demonstration. But so imagine this in a circle, because I agree, it's very cyclical. But we started this project by co-developing the project proposal. As I mentioned, this was kind of jumping from an existing relationship that we had, and we had already begun to kind of scratch the surface and pose some of the research questions when we realized we had the opportunity to develop this into a fuller project proposal with the Hudson River Foundation. So we sat together and kind of talked with our partners to see if we wanted to expand the scope and move forward with this project, which was a great opportunity to kind of meet and hash out exactly what we needed to do and think about our goals. And I do want to acknowledge that they shifted even throughout the project development phase. We had, different climate hazards that we were thinking about focusing on. We had different methods of collecting data that we went back and forth on. And I think just being able to meet with our partners and develop this proposal with them was extremely valuable to kind of just understand where we were coming from and where we were hoping to go. The next was to iterate on design. So this was even after the project was funded and we were starting to work together. We maintained regular project meetings, at least monthly on kind of some off times, but then more than twice a week when we're really working on data collection efforts, to kind of keep the project going, maintaining our momentum, but then continuing to reflect on our goals together. And so I think just having those forms of open communication, we're accessible to each other often. And again, that comes from making sure that our partners are supported and funded to participate in this project was really key. The next stage, thinking about collaborative data collection and analysis. This was important for us to make sure that we were sharing the responsibility for data collection with our partners. They were really designing it, but they were also on the ground helping us to collect surveys, ask folks to join for workshops, do some of the recruitment. And then we have been leading on some of the initial data analysis, but really sending that back to our partners to hear back from them and finding other ways, including public workshops, which we just hosted last week, to kind of invite some reflection from our partners and also community members on our initial data. We're going to go back and continue this iterative analysis, and then finally move into the last phase where we disseminate with an eye for impact. And so we acknowledge that we kind of have sometimes divergent goals as academics and practitioners, and we want to be able to meet both of them. So I'm sure we'll have some academic peer-reviewed articles, but we'll also have in particular, interactive website content that our partners are really excited about hosting on their space, on their websites, that they can then use to apply for future funding, to kind of cite green infrastructure projects in their communities. They can kind of go out to their policymakers and communicate some of the impact of the efforts that they have been engaged in. Okay. So I want to share some initial findings from our project. It was really divided into two phases. And the first phase was focusing on kind of that analysis of capacity, understanding the capacity of these community-based organizations as they continue to take on increasing responsibility for adaptation in these spaces. And then we move into the extreme rainfall portion, which I'll get into in a moment. So in this part one of the project, we conducted a series of interviews with our partner organizations, their staff, and also partners that they worked with through kind of snowball sampling methods to understand, again, some of those governance factors that influence the strategies that they implement to lead adaptation in their spaces, and also some of the barriers that they encounter. And then to get really deeply into that community engagement aspect, we hosted 2 cross-community workshops last summer, one in Elizabeth and one in Yonkers, where we brought folks from either city to the other to learn about adaptation projects happening in the other city, and then host a focus group discussion where people talked about their priorities for public engagement, what was missing, what they wanted to see. And then we also had pre and post workshop surveys from these folks to learn a little bit more about their priorities for climate adaptation in Elizabeth and Yonkers. So from these workshops, we kind of pulled out some really important engagement priorities that then fed into the second phase of our project. We heard from people that they really wanted to make sure that they were connected to policymakers. They understand that a lot of these workshops are, again, the usual suspects kind of coming together, sharing their thoughts, but oftentimes it could be kind of screaming into a void, right? If the policymakers aren't in the room or they're not hearing the findings of this work, where are we going to go from here? We talked about the importance of continuing to empower community members to participate through educational opportunities and also through employment. This kind of reflected a lot of our partners' priorities in employing youth across the cities. And a lot of the people who have been engaged in this work kind of point to the ability to have a summer job to kind of open the doorway into adaptation. These are people who are really interested in environmental services. Making sure that they're compensated to do that work is a necessary step. Accounting and addressing legacies of exclusion in terms of community engagement in these projects was really key. In particular, both of our groups have done extensive research on the impacts of redlining and climate change in their spaces, and making sure that they're kind of going into the communities that are more impacted by climate risks and have also historically been excluded from decision-making opportunities to participate and to kind of base some of their interventions in those spaces. And then finally, the community members were eager for opportunities for intergenerational, cross-cultural, and creative expression, which we really did kind of draw on that last point in particular in our phase 2 of this project. The findings from the first phase also fed into a framework, as I highlighted, that helped us to kind of parse and understand those governance factors that are really influencing the transformative potential of some of the efforts of local leaders to adapt to climate risks in the Hudson River watershed and really meaningfully address community needs. So focus on how these factors can kind of both enable and constrain these really transformative change within these spaces can help us understand the impact of this research project and others beyond. So just to kind of briefly touch on some of these factors, partners in politics, engagement, funding, information and data, and then finally qualities and approach in the center there. Those were 5 factors that kind of emerged through our interview processes and our cross-community workshops. Partners in politics from earlier today on Rupu's point, it's a really complex network of people that are always working together to kind of push adaptive action forward. And so understanding how these partnerships are made and how sometimes political priorities can be competing with each other is really important when we're kind of setting agendas for adaptation. Community engagement, we acknowledge that local leaders are often more grounded and have kind of opportunities to engage with their communities very directly, as opposed to potentially an academic researcher who has a reputation of helicoptering into a community and leaving. But they're also, local leaders can be constrained by how much they engage with their communities through the usual suspects. Not enough time, not enough money. Language barriers are really key, especially in these communities that we were working on. Funding, of course, is a huge factor, emerged as kind of the number one thing that local leaders would highlight. As community-based organizations, they're in a position to kind of maintain a really flexible and mixed portfolio to support some of their work, which is great. Some of our partners have been implementing a fee-for-service kind of design where they kind of can charge community spaces to go in and clean up, plant trees, etc. But they're always constrained by the availability and amount of funding they have to work with. In terms of information and data, these groups are kind of pushing forward really unique and innovative community science initiatives, storytelling, and that intergenerational opportunity for engagement. But they're also constrained by a lack of downscale climate data, for instance. Also, funders and other institutional supporters' preference for kind of quantitative measures of their projects that are sometimes difficult for them to communicate. And then the final factor that we identified here is the qualities and approaches of these groups. And this is really what these groups kind of shared as their personal understanding of the community-based organization, their commitments to service in these spaces that have enabled them to kind of persevere through some of these challenges. Their ability to be kind of innovative and flexible and quick to move helps them to kind of push forward and sustain their work. So this framework, we hope, can be used in other settings to kind of help practitioners understand their maybe spaces that they need to grow their capacity, to help researchers understand kind of the complex network involved in taking some of these actions and moving them forward, turning these community priorities that we heard from the community and we continue to hear into impact and action. Part 2 of our project is focusing on understanding extreme rainfall. And in the interest of time, I'm going to move a little bit quickly through this, unfortunately, but I'd be happy to share more. We conducted community surveys in Elizabeth and Yonkers. This is just a little snapshot of some of the data that we have for Elizabeth in this example. And then, as I mentioned last week, we hosted these amazing workshops, one in Elizabeth, one in Yonkers. And these were for community members to kind of take in some of the initial findings of our work and give us feedback immediately, which was great. We had a community mapping exercise where we posted some of our initial maps on the walls. Community members added Post-it notes to kind of share stories and talk about the dots that they saw at other spaces where it flooded in Elizabeth again. And then we also had a kind of priority agenda setting brainstorming session. People heard about existing green infrastructure solutions in the region and elsewhere and thought about what they wanted to see. We also talked about built infrastructure solutions, policy and governance interventions, and community and social infrastructure spaces where people could kind of think up ideas. And the findings from this work are going to be summarized and guide kind of our partners' future programming. It's going to help them to develop future projects within these community spaces. And then, as I mentioned, we're also going to kind of put this all together onto an interactive web-based platform where they can continue to communicate the impacts of this work with policymakers and advocates moving forward. So to conclude, I just want to kind of think a little bit about some of the impact that I had mentioned earlier. And again, we're thinking about our findings being useful for funders and other supporters, for researchers and practitioners. We're hoping in particular that that framework can help to guide institutional design and kind of implement better support programming for local leaders in this region and beyond, working on adaptation efforts, in particular for funders and other supporters. How can we kind of enable more effective and equitable locally led adaptation, including by understanding those complex needs of community-based organizations who are, again, taking on increasing responsibility for some of these projects, especially in some of these kind of smaller cities in the region. How can researchers better kind of design some of these engaged and collaborative work moving forward? And then for practitioners, how can they kind of communicate their needs and identify these areas for growth within their own work? We also hope that the findings are going to continue to support decision making and enable improved community engagement, both for our partners and beyond. So priorities that I went over kind of emerging from those cross-community workshops, connecting community voices with policymakers, enabling more creative engagement, for example. We hope that those will structure, again, the engagements of our partners and others. Finally, we do hope that some of these findings can help reduce some of the risk from extreme rainfall. Again, this is just one small focus of how we can kind of apply this locally led efforts into small adaptation projects throughout the region. But we hope that we can see kind of a difference and funnel some of those evidence-based findings into CBO programming. And then finally, communicating the impact with the community through different types of deliverables, such as that interactive web mapping, and thinking about the workshops also as a piece of a point in time where people can kind of really work through some of these findings together. So with that, I will conclude and just say thanks so much. And we have our emails, including the emails of our community partners, if folks have questions.